good to see everybody today. My name is Adam Oster, and I am the Community Engagement Librarian at the Library of Michigan. And we are welcome today with 2024 Michigan Notable Books author Frank Uhle, who wrote Cinema Ann Arbor: How Campus Rebels Forged a Singular Film Culture. This is from Fifth Avenue Press and the University of Michigan Press, and is one of 2024 Michigan Notable Books titles. A few other things about it, besides being a notable book title, it was also shortlisted for the 2023 Alice Award and also a winner of the 2023 Michigan State History Award. So it's kind of running the gambit of being honored. One other thing that you can do is to learn more about the book and about Frank is to go to cinemaannarbor.com.
Mhm.
Frank is a cultural historian who writes about the fascinating people and stories behind beloved film and music projects, with a great emphasis on his adopted hometown of Ann Arbor. Projectionist since the early 1980s, his devotion to film was catalyzed when he joined one of the University of Michigan Student Film Societies as an undergraduate, and has been a participant in the film community ever since then. Been published in a wide number of different publications. Also contributed as a host to a long-running radio program on WCBN that highlights Michigan music, and a frequent contributor to a wide range of other publications. Frank, it's great to have you here with us.
Thank you so much, Adam. I appreciate the
Yep.
opportunity.
Is there anything about your biography that I haven't touched on that maybe you think viewers would want to know about your experiences, or something that maybe was that early spark that kind of compelled you to participate in the film world?
Well, I was sort of a nerdy film fan in like high school, but I was into like exploitation monster movies kind of stuff. So there was this guy that was on late at night called the Ghoul, and he would do like he wore like a weird lab coat and had little weird buttons, and he would blow things up with firecrackers. He was just like a crazy, chaotic character. But he would host these really cheap monster movies. They had like cheap movie deals. So they'd be these really low budget films, and I got to kind of liking the aesthetic of kind of
Mhm.
the low budget film, which like Roger Corman. He actually he would put some interesting weird little tidbits in the film. So that was when I first started being interested in film, and also as a young kid, my mom had taken me to see 2001: A Space Odyssey when I
Mhm.
was like 10 years old, when it was brand new. And it just kind of like tripped me out. It was just such a weird, there were so many aspects of that movie. Even if you see it today, there's just like long sequences like the spaceships floating in the air. So I always had this sort of aesthetic of movies that I wasn't really into the narrative Hollywood kind of boy meets girl, boy loses girl,
Mhm.
they get back together in the end. I always liked the kind of offbeat movies. So when I came to University of Michigan, I had a friend who was in one of these student film societies, and he said, "Oh, you can join too." And of course, I failed to join the one he was in. I failed to join the other one I thought was cool, and I got into one that kind of no one really thought about much called Cinema Two. And from that, it turned out I was able to go get a little pass to all the free movies on campus, and I became just absorbing films of
Mhm.
all different kinds. So my monster movie Roger Corman interest quickly morphed into seeing every different kind of film. And it was like a second major in college for me.
Do you remember the first film that you saw after you got your card, or one of the first original
One
ones?
of the first ones, yeah, it was this movie. And again, and this is what I wrote the book about.
Mhm.
There were these student film societies. The campus, this was 1979, was a hotbed of film. There were 7 different film societies. Some nights of the week, there'd be 15 different movies to choose from. And there'd be movies 7 days a week. And you could just go see everything from a silent movie with a person playing the piano to a Humphrey Bogart movie to the latest art films from like New Yorker films that hadn't even played like in Detroit yet. So I was going to all these movies and I would read the schedules and we would describe all the movies. And Most of the movies no one had seen. You couldn't see a trailer. There was no online presence. And I saw this movie called The Connection. It was like 1961, low budget film directed by a woman named Shirley Jackson. I think that's her name, in New York. And it was based on a stage play about a bunch of heroin addicted jazz musicians waiting for their connection to come. And I just was like, this is the kind of movie kind of combine different elements of like weirdness and offbeatness. And so, yeah, that was like, I remember going to the Cinema 2 meeting and saying, I just was at the Connection last week. You guys showed it. It was really cool.
Mhm. So what would be sort of the first memory that would have compelled you to write your book? Was there something that sort of like sparked, oh, I feel I need to take my experiences, do some research and start getting this compiled into this wonderful thing that you have right here.
It's weird because I had been writing a lot of things for kind of paid publications. I had some friends who were editors at Gale Research, was based in Detroit and publishes like hundreds of reference books series. And they were like, oh, we need somebody to write these business histories. And I had actually gone to library school and learned how to do research and things. So I was like, yeah, I can do that. I hadn't really written a sort of term paper like thing in a few years. But I started doing that. And then as I built kind of writing skills and researching skills, I started realizing I liked writing. I never ever thought I would be any kind of a writer. In fact, when I turned my last term paper in library school, I was like, that's it. No more of this nonsense. But
I
then,
know that feeling.
I know, I was like, I'm done with that. But 5 or so years later, these friends of mine were like, well, you want to make $300? Well, you can write this company history. I was like, all right.
Mhm,
And but yeah, so I started doing that and I really liked it. And so anyhow, along the way, I started thinking, well, I met these guys. I've always been really interested in history.
mhm,
So even like when I was a young kid, when I was about 15, I went to the public library's annual book sale, and they had just bought, if you can picture this, the entire run of Time magazine on microfilm. So they had the original print
mhm,
editions going back to the early 30s, and they were like, well, we're getting rid of those now. We don't need them. So
mhm,
for $2 a year, I got like every Time magazine from 1933 to 1957. I was just like, well, I'm going to buy these, obviously, So I would sit there at night as a teenager reading like from cover to cover a 1934 Time magazine and looking at the ads for the cars and stuff. But I don't know, there's something about history, recording history and thinking about history as time goes on, the living witnesses are fading away. And I thought, so I wrote several things about music in Ann Arbor,
mhm.
history of this teen rock and roll club called the Fifth Dimension, where Jimi Hendrix and the Who and the Yardbirds and all these people played, and no one really had ever compiled the history. And then it was 2016, and the University of Michigan was doing its bicentennial celebration in 2017. And I thought, well, the film societies were an important part of campus culture, but they had faded away with videotape and everything and streaming, and they were forgotten. Nobody, if you asked people on campus, did you ever see, what Cinema Guild is? They'd say, no. But Cinema Guild used to show movies 7 days a week and bring in like Frank Capra to come and speak on campus and all these big name people. So I proposed to the bicentennial committee people that I would write a history of this. So I started writing it, and I really thought it would be like 5,000 or 8,000 words, which I had written pieces of that length a few times. But every time I talked to someone, they'd say, well, you should talk to this other guy who I didn't even know who it was. And that person would tell me some wild story. And so I started realizing that it was growing and growing, and I was going to miss the deadline for the bicentennial. And it just kept growing. That's all I can say. It turned into a book.
So would you say then were how much more material do you think that you have that's beyond just what you were able to fit in here? Um, would you be able to write much more than that, or are there like little vignette stories that you think that you could possibly pull out of it as well? Because like I was reading through your book, I'm like, wow, you compiled a lot in there, but I have to, I have to believe there's even more beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the challenge of being a writer,
Yeah.
and this is one thing I enjoy, is you really have to think about the reader. So you have to think, you know, is this just going to be a checklist of every single thing that's ever happened?
Mhm.
And a person that's reading it is going to fall over or sleep?
Yeah.
Or are you going to structure it in a way that has some drama? And, you have to prioritize. You have to leave things on the cutting room floor.
Mhm.
And frankly, being a movie fan, I'll just make a movie reference.
Yeah.
Like Apocalypse Now, they released it 139 minutes. And then 10 years, 20 years later, Francis Ford Coppola comes back and says, well, there's actually another half hour of stuff that I cut out of the original version.
Mhm.
And he puts it back in, and you watch the new long version, and you're like, what happened, dude? You blew it, man. You should have, the cut version is the good version.
Yeah.
Even expensive, fancy, cool scenes, the narrative just bogs down.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to avoid. So yeah, there's a few things, but I really strove to put every cool detail I could in the book in a way that the reader would come back, and think, wow, I'm reading a story here. I'm not just looking at some kind of, list of things.
Yeah.
So there's not too much that didn't make the book. I mean, it was, I tried to interview someone from every film society that stretched throughout their entire timeline. So I found people that were there for like 10 years, and I find someone else who overlapped for the next 10 years and then the next 10 years.
Mhm.
So the important parts of the story, I felt like I had got enough living witnesses to say I knew that I wasn't leaving anything out.
Yeah. Okay. So then, along the lines, just as describing yourself, what are sort of three words that describes you as a writer, and what makes those the sort of three key things about yourself as a writer?
Well, I thought about this a bit. You told me about this question in advance.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, thorough. I'm very thorough. I don't like to leave any stones unturned.
Mhm.
And that's why I had a book instead of a magazine article, because once I started realizing there was some stuff that I needed to find two more witnesses to really build that story.
Mhm.
So thorough, and then dedicated, because again, I stuck with this for about 6 years, and I saw it through to print. I didn't just say, well, this is kind of fun, but I really wanted it to achieve what it did, which is the final form, which I have to give full credit to the Fifth Avenue Press and the U of M Press. It just blew my mind. The way they printed it on, glossy paper with color on every page,
Mhm.
and the end result exceeded my expectations. But yeah, I was dedicated to making sure I gave it my absolute best shot. And I also, you know, would say I'm reader friendly. I really wanted it to be something that was enjoyable because, I've read enough history books, and if I'm interested in the subject, I'll read through it, I'll slog through it. But gosh, sometimes you just think, man, if this had been edited a little bit better or
Mhm.
presented better, it would be so much, I would, it would reach more people. It would have, you know, appeal beyond the very hardcore. And frankly, I am kind of proud to say that a number of people who have read this book who were not part of the film scene at all have been very enthusiastic about it. And I feel like that was my goal, was to give this history some life beyond its the choir, so that
Mhm.
wow, Ann Arbor had a cool film scene from a guy in England told me, I mean that made me really happy.
Well, and something that I even appreciated very much too was the good balance between the text and what you were writing, but also the visuals that went with them. That even towards the end, it was like after a certain point, and I don't want to give too much away, but there's just a section where it's just all visuals. And I think for somebody who is trying to understand the breadth of how much this was part of the culture in Ann Arbor and part of the University
Mhm.
of Michigan, I think you did a good balance between both the text and what you were talking about, wanting to illustrate to people, but also giving them other characteristics of it so that they could see, like, or at least better visualize what that was as you're talking about it, in the book itself. So we've kind of talked a little bit about what inspired you, certainly your experiences in the film industry, being part of one of the guilds. Was there any other sorts of things that sort of brought you to want to write this? Was there, like, say, maybe a particular interview with one of the people that you talked with that was like, oh, I really need to get this down into some sort of a book form?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, it was largely what I said earlier about I would just look around this town of Ann Arbor, and it felt like all these film societies had done, and I was a part of, had just vanished, and no one even knew it existed anymore. And I kind of wanted to say it did exist. And and again, as I started talking to people, there were aspects of the story that I'd known a little bit about, but one of the parts of the story is that a lot of the people who were really formative people in the story were gay men. There were, I don't know of any lesbians, but four or five of my leading participants were gay men who, in the time they were involved, were very closeted. And several of them were arrested. University of Michigan used to not have its own police force, and the city of Ann Arbor would have cops walking through the buildings, with their pistols and the whole 9 yards, and they poke in the bathrooms, and they would actually entrap people.
Mhm.
And I just, there are parts of the story, the cultural, uh, the film part is one part of the story, but the parts that were like, gosh, it was such a different time, and these people were struggling against, societal barriers, and there was censorship. One of the professors was arrested,
Mhm.
and a whole bunch of stuff happened that I just thought this has to be recorded and preserved because, again, that one of the professors who sadly just died, I dedicated the book to him, Hugh Cohen, was, still teaching at the age of 93. And
Mhm.
he's got his office in the film department. And all the other people that walked past his office did not know much about him. They just thought, oh, that's that old guy who comes in a little bit.
Mhm.
But he was arrested in 1967 for showing, a movie with, drag queens and full frontal nudity. And the people today, they take it for granted that we
Mhm.
can watch that on YouTube. And I just felt like, and so when I published the book, I remember sitting in the office of one of the film professors, and he was like, "This is really, good." And then the chair of the department came in, and she said, "What's that?" I said, "Oh, that's Frank's book." And she said, "Really?" And he opened it and he said, "Here's Hugh Cohen, who's down the hall. It was his mugshot." And she was like, she literally, her jaw just dropped open. And then she goes, "He was a really good looking guy." But but yeah, so they got so excited about that mugshot that they
Yeah.
said, "We are going to blow up the mugshot and hang it in the hall in a frame to show people, where this department's roots are." And
Yeah.
nobody knew that though, really. A few people did, but as time changes, all the people, there's no one else around from his generation, and he's not bragging about it.
Yeah.
So anyhow, that was an important part of the thing to me.
Yeah, it just further illustrates that this isn't just people going to watch film, that there's a expanded culture and sense of community that's
Right.
all around this. And for somebody like me who's from the west side of the state, I grew up near Grand Rapids, Holland, Zealand area, and having no idea that something like this was even taking place in the history of our state. Like the closest that I would ever get to it is the Knickerbocker Theater over in Holland, that they would
Okay.
be showing some, various films over there, but nothing to the extent of what you're demonstrating was going on in Ann Arbor. That was certainly one of the things that's like, okay, I'm glad that for me as a reader, and I hope other people take away too, that like there is this whole completely separate element of Michigan history that is
Mhm.
now chronicled in something like this.
Yeah,
So
no, I just want to interject.
yeah.
Another aspect of that is that, these film societies existed in a large percentage of the time when the university wasn't really teaching film at all or had kind of scattered film classes. And people who grew up here, like Ken Burns,
Hmm.
Michael Moore, would drive down from Flint. A couple of the people in the film societies I was friends with have all gone on to major careers as filmmakers. And almost to a person that I spoke with, they credit the Ann Arbor Film Societies as
Hmm.
being formative. And not because they took film classes, but because they could go to see a movie 7 nights a week of all different
Hmm.
genres. And visiting filmmakers, Robert Altman's coming in, Frank
Yeah.
Capra, Sam Fuller, for Andy Warhol and the Velvet Underground.
Hmm.
Those experiences couldn't happen on most college campuses. Most colleges had like a film society of, varying strengths, but Ann Arbor had just one of the top cultures in the country. So it really inspired. I mean, again, I had the privilege of interviewing Ken Burns for the book, And he was just like, yeah, I used to go to the Ann Arbor Film
Mhm.
Festival when I was like a high school kid and watch these wild experimental films. And that informs his worldview. You know, he didn't take film classes. He just
Mhm.
became a film knowledge person from absorbing it. And a lot of it was presented in these film societies.
Well, and even I liked it where you talked about the relationship between him and his father and how that impacted the two of them with film.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that was a way that they could be able to talk to each other on a certain level, especially with many of the circumstances that were because I think you talk about on there that his mother had significant health issues
Yeah.
and
His mother had died when he was 11. So he
yeah.
had a kind of, sad high school years recovering from that loss. And
Mhm.
film was something that he and his father shared.
Yeah, yeah, and where else? I got to see him talk one time, and that was certainly nothing that would have come up in the conversation. But getting to read that in the book certainly illustrates just another aspect about him and
Mhm.
the impact of both film and the Ann Arbor film scene.
Mhm.
So for you as an author, what's sort of the most meaningful part of cinema Ann Arbor?
You know, I you mentioned this earlier, but I from the start was really keyed in on getting good images. So every person I interview, I'd ask, do you have any photos or can I scan your photos? I had I have a scanner at home. And that to me it was 50% of the book was presenting visual documentation. And I had some amazing luck, like in Ann Arbor here at the Bentley Historical Library. And some of these things happened at the very end of the process. I found something that I had missed before. But like in the early 30s, there was this, one of the first film societies in the country, possibly the first campus film society in the country, hard to prove, the Art Cinema League. And some people in the U of M library system had been collecting their flyers
Mhm.
back in those days. And I found this one, folder at a library. You're a librarian.
Yep.
This is why libraries exist. And this person had saved a membership card and flyers from different events and all sorts of cool stuff. And I was able to get scans of those. The Bentley, awesome. They scan things, and that first couple chapters would have just been barren if I didn't have an actual membership card. And
Mhm.
incredible stuff. And then later on, and the Bentley also has the archives of the Michigan Daily student newspaper, and they had boxes and boxes of negatives, mostly from the 60s and 70s.
Mhm.
But I would go through those envelopes, and sometimes they were poorly documented, just say like a date on it. And I'd look in it, and there'd be the negatives of like Joan Rivers speaking on campus, like with knee-high black leather boots on,
Mhm.
kneeling down. And those were unpublished. The negatives were the entire shoot, and someone had put one picture in the paper of like a headshot. And
Mhm.
here are these other really cool photos. So I was able to I went hog wild. I got photos, and then I had one of the Film Society Cinema Guild had some friends of mine had saved their office files, and they were in a
Mhm.
basement, and I knew who they had those. My good friend Reed Lenz, I went to high school with, and he just came over one day and threw them all in my living room and said, "They're yours now." And those were full of like a pile this high of all the
Mhm.
Film Society schedules going back to the 70s or 60s in some cases, and like financial ledgers. So, to be able to scan images of those and put them in the book, as you say, it allows you to immerse yourself in the thing. And to me, it's almost like primary research. It's like now you're going to the archives yourself and you're looking at these schedules, and you can look on them and see things that I'm not necessarily writing about, but
Mhm.
you could say, oh, well, they were showing this movie and this movie. So I really wanted to make it a kind of almost make the book collaborative in the sense that you're looking at actual photos and you can pick out the interesting details yourself.
Did it feel like you could see trends that maybe that films that were being created overseas and that
Mhm.
within certain period of time all of a sudden they're showing up in Ann Arbor or
Yeah. Oh no, yeah. I mean, I have examples of the film programs from the 30s through the 80s, so you can see it to the 90s. So you can see a full page schedule in the book this big, and you can read all the films that were being shown that semester. And yeah, exactly. That's a chronicle right there of some of the trends.
yeah. Cool. What would you want readers to take away from your book?
Well, we pretty much talked about it.
Yeah.
Just that, I guess the subtitle of the book, How Campus Rebels Forged a Singular Film Culture. I mean, I've worked at U of M for many years. I'm a two-time U of M alum.
Mhm.
And, if you look at the U of M Alumni Association and all the focus on sports and this kind of thing,
Mhm.
I feel like there just is too little uh, credit given to the kind of campus misfits. And this to me is a story about campus misfits. It's people who some of them didn't, graduate, or they didn't finish they got one degree and then they went and did an entirely different career. And, people go to college to find themselves. And, sometimes it's because there is privilege involved and their parents can afford to send them. But, a lot of the people that were in the film societies in my day were kind of, oddballs, and they didn't have a good place, but we all kind of came together in this thing. And we were working not just to do something odd, but we were presenting a cultural program that was everyone saw, so people from the mainstream college students would come and see, the new Indiana Jones movie on a date. And then the arty film students would come and see The Connection, and the 15 people would see that. And we just gave this broad spectrum, but we ourselves wanted to see the weird, obscure movies. But, we just kind of, it was like a team effort. It was like we were all working together to achieve this, broader spectrum of stuff. But we were all kind of the weirdos, but we've had a sense of responsibility. We wanted to give a good thing together. And I just feel like over time, that appreciation for that has kind of been lost. It's still people celebrate the more high profile stuff, but in our day, in the day of these film societies, this was a vital force on campus. This in a lot of ways made Ann Arbor a film centric town. And we have the Michigan Theater and the State Theater now, which present art films, which was definitely inspired by the film societies
Mhm.
and carries on a tradition. There's a lot of people in the town who came here because of all the film offerings. In fact, I found internal U of M documents that were like admitting that they recruited professors who would come into town and say, I'd rather have a job here than somewhere else because you guys got all these cool movies.
Mhm.
We're like, we don't want to lose the film societies because we're pitching it to faculty recruits. And, again, it's just, I feel like I want that place of those campus rebels to be appreciated, because even though at the time maybe people looked at us as, you know, kind of ne'er-do-wells who
Mhm.
weren't taking classes seriously or whatever. And I have, several friends who flunked out and now have important jobs because they were creative people and
Mhm.
they couldn't quite make it as a college student. But this gave you an experience that you took on in life. So
Mhm.
I'm celebrating that.
Yeah, well, and I think I got to hear you speak one time before this, and it was interesting just learning about how this place in the Midwest had this, cultural, you know, element to it that you would not find in too many, this really wasn't occurring in Chicago or other major cities that are regional, Indianapolis, anything like, places like that. And, uh, were there places elsewhere in the United States that would even come close to this at all, or outside of because Ann Arbor isn't really it's not Hollywood, it's not New York City. How does that all sort of fit in together, in comparing and contrasting
Yeah,
the
I mean, I tried to do some nailing that down because around the country there have been a few places like Austin,
Mhm.
Madison, and college towns, bigger college towns that have been compared to Ann Arbor in those days. And it was so hard, I couldn't. It was just impossible to apples and oranges. But
Yeah.
but it was pretty clear again, especially it's really critical because it's so different today. But in those days, pre like 1985, you had to get a reel of film. You had to get a can of film to show on a screen, and that was a big barrier.
Mhm.
A person in a small town, or a small college, it was expensive. You had to find the equipment to show it with. In Ann Arbor, we kind of cobbled together not only 16 millimeter, which was the standard, we had 35 millimeter, which then opened us up to new foreign releases, brand new. We had the United States premiere of Aguirre, The Wrath of God by Werner Herzog, which was a month before it played in New York. And, but we had the equipment to show it.
Hmm.
And there were just these aggressive people that were like, we're going to do it. And so, Ann Arbor clearly had a cutting edge kind of thing going on. And
Hmm.
even for, other colleges, which would show a film series, they might show films like Friday and Saturday, or maybe
Hmm.
3 or 4 nights. But we literally had 7 days a week, and not just in the school year, but in the summer, maybe five
Hmm.
nights a week, all year long. So the town people came to the movies, the students came to the movies, and a lot of people I know who grew up here, their parents would take them to Cinema Guild shows of like classic films, because again, you couldn't see them easily on television even in
Hmm.
those days in the 60s and 70s. They're like, oh, let's go see King Kong. Well, an 8-year-old kid goes to see King Kong. I talked to recently a guy named Roger Miller, who's in a bunch of bands, Mission of Burma, and he's also in this group called the Alloy Orchestra that does silent film scores around the world. They're incredible, top silent film accompanist in the world. And he was like, yeah, I was when I was a kid, my parents took me to see Buster Keaton and the General and at Cinema Guild, and it just kind of like was a formative event for me.
Hmm.
So, it really Ann Arbor had a pretty serious film thing going on. And
Nice.
and again, it was all concentrated within a few blocks. So I'd get out of a movie at like 7, and 5 minutes later, I'd be in the next auditorium, a block away, watching another. I mean, you'd see 3 different movies, and then you might say, well, gosh, I missed that one movie. And we would grab the film, the 16 millimeter film, and take it to someone's house and show it on the wall.
Jeez.
I mean, I remember sitting watching this obscure Sam Fuller movie, Shot Corridor, with a friend of mine on the
Mhm.
wall of his apartment, and we were talking, and all of a sudden I noticed that the sun was coming in the blinds, the edges. I was like, dude, we've been up since midnight watching this movie. So, but that was just part of the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's an experience that you probably will always appreciate that you got to have that. Well, speaking of experiences, let's just kind of switch a little bit of gears. So, what was your reaction when you learned that Cinema Ann Arbor was selected as a Michigan Notable Book Title?
I mean, I'm sure nobody has told you, oh, I was like, oh, no big deal. No, it was unbelievable. It was just so exciting and gratifying because, I mean, I worked so hard on the book and I really put my heart and soul into it. And then again, Fifth Avenue Press, U of M Press
Hmm.
gave it like top notch, design team. Nate Poggi Morrison, Amanda Zott, and Amy Aarons are the design team that worked for U of M or for Fifth Avenue Press, did
Hmm.
an incredible job. And then U of M Press said, let's just publish it full on, hardcover, slipcase, the whole 9 yards.
Hmm.
So I had a feeling it was going to be an above average book. And but the fact that it won that award just was the icing on the cake. I mean, it was just like kind of unbelievable.
Who was the first person you told?
But I told my wife, and my wife had been coaching me. My wife actually is a book publisher herself,
Okay.
publisher of McSweeney's, based in San Francisco. She runs it from our house in Ann Arbor. But so she was like, I think you have a shot for a Michigan notable. And I was like, I don't know. And we were watching, for signs like in the what newspaper might report it, or we got no hints. But so when the news came through,
Hmm.
it was just like, woo. Yeah, it was tremendous. Again, it's such an honor. I mean, the
Yeah.
people who got the awards, that year and every year
Hmm.
are it's heady company to be in.
Yeah. I've been involved with the program now for about 5 years, and it still amazes me how great this is to be able to honor books, especially ones that just I'll admit I never would have picked up a book like this or known that something like this would have been
Mhm.
available, and being able to see that on a list with 19 other titles that run the gamut of topics all related to Michigan.
Mhm.
It's just awesome. Um,
No, I
So,
have to say, I have to thank you and the Library of Michigan so much because it gives a credibility to your work that
mhm,
you wouldn't have otherwise. To know that that is always, going to be on that book
mhm.
is just really a top, accomplishment and honor.
Well, it's very well deserved.
Thank you.
Um, so what, just to kind of maybe get a little bit more into more your interests, like what books are currently uh giving you joy, making you think, currently ones that you're kind of got on the table right now that you're reading, just for your own pleasure.
Sure. I wrote it down just so I wouldn't mess up the title. Um, I often like books that I find in like little free libraries or
Hmm.
book sales. Just, it's like going to a bookstore and browsing, you're like,
Hmm.
oh, that looks interesting. And soon enough you're reading it. Yeah, I found this book at a yard sale at a block from my friend's house. But it was called Reporting World War II, American Journalism, 1938 to 1944. And it's published by the Library of America, which
Hmm.
strives to publish books, keep them in print, archival paper. But it's a compilation of journalism from those years, 1938 to 1944. There's a
Hmm.
second volume, also 44 to 46, I think. But it's like right out of the newspapers from those years. So you're reading about like pivotal events during World War II, but they're like that was as reported that day in the New York
Hmm.
Times or Life magazine. But the people who did this did such a good job. They got things like African American newspapers. So
Hmm.
like the Chicago Defender, here's a report on how black soldiers are being treated in the training camps in the South that
Hmm.
most people wouldn't have read outside of the black community.
Hmm.
And so it's an amazing, really amazing book published um, a nice thick book of, I mean, I'm in 1942 now. I've read like the first 4 years, but
Hmm.
yeah, so I love that book. Another book I found at that same sale is called Bright Day by J.B. Priestley, and it's a book about a guy who was a screenwriter writing a movie, and then runs into these people by accident, and they're like from his past. And he's trying to remember why he has this weird interest, why they have this weird effect on him emotionally, and it was actually written in 1946.
Hmm.
But it was like, I don't know, I've just been enjoying reading that. So,
It just goes to show that there's both great books that are being published now, and there's all these good ones from the past that people should check out.
yeah, no, and I'll put in one more plug. My
Yeah.
wife is just finished writing a memoir that's going to be published next year called Destroy This House by Amanda Uhle. And I just read that too. So I'm not just stuck in the past. I have a new book that I just read as well.
Well, good one for future lists for plenty of other people to check out too, and
Yeah.
maybe future notable. Well,
Oh,
you got some competition there.
yeah. I don't know if you have any married couples who have both had Michigan notables. We'll shoot for that. That'll be our goal.
I can think of one. Well, they
Okay.
wrote the book together, but Chris Byron and Tom Wilson, over in the
Okay.
Grand Rapids area,
All right.
are at least one that I can think of. But if it happened, you'd be among a very small number.
Okay. All right. Well, we're gonna just knock on wood on that.
Yep.
See what
Well,
happens.
well, thank you very much. This was a really wonderful conversation, and I just want to plug again Cinema Ann Arbor as one of the 20 titles on the 2024 Michigan Notable Books list. Check it out. You can learn more about the book itself by going to cinemaannarbor.com, and you can also check out more information about the Michigan Notable Books list on michigan.gov/notable books. Frank, again, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
And thank you so much. This has just been wonderful to talk with you. And again, the Library of Michigan does incredible work, and I appreciate everything you guys do to keep people reading and freedom of speech and all the good stuff. It's a really vital part of our society and our cultural heritage. So thank you.